The story of Sarah, who discovered her husband's infidelity, and then found out that he was cheating on her too. She decided to leave him and start a new life with her son. Daniel and Sarah lived in Chicago, Illinois. They had been married for 10 years and had 2 children, a boy named Jacob and a girl named Lina. There were many ordinary moments in their lives when everything seemed to be in place. But one day everything changed. Sarah decided to commit a betrayal that turned their lives upside down. She met someone at work, a man with whom her relationship gained an intensity that she was not ready for. In the first months, she could not understand what was happening to her. She was used to being with Daniel, but something was missing. After several meetings and secret calls, she realized that she could no longer deceive herself. And at that moment, when everything became obvious, Sarah didn't know how to tell her husband the truth. Daniel was a trusted and reliable man. He trusted Sarah, and she trusted him. They had worked on their relationship for many years, but everything changed after he found out about her betrayal. It was a big blow for him, because he couldn't understand why it had happened. Was it his fault? Or was Sarah simply missing something in their relationship? And although he was depressed, Daniel was determined in his desire to save the family. He tried to talk to Sarah, but he felt that the gap between them was growing wider. She could no longer live in the same house with him, and her heart yearned for a new beginning, even if it meant leaving everything behind. But over time, as the pressure and pain eased, Sarah began to look for a way back. She realized that despite her betrayal, she still wanted to reconnect with Daniel. She began to look for ways to fix her mistakes, even if it required a lot of work and effort. Every day her desire to turn everything back became stronger, but she knew that she could not do it without help. She began to work on herself, turned to a psychologist and tried to understand why she had taken this step. However, Daniel was shocked not only by her betrayal, but also by how he himself felt. He was not ready to forgive, but at the same time he could not let go of the family they had built together. When he saw how Sarah changed and how she was ready to work on herself, he began to doubt. Can everything be returned to what it was before? Is there a chance to restore their relationship, or is it better to leave everything in the past? Thus began their difficult journey to reconciliation, which required more patience than they could have imagined. Sarah did not expect that the path to reconciliation would be so difficult. She thought she could just talk to Daniel, apologize, and everything would be resolved. But as she began to work on herself, she realized that everything was much deeper than just admitting her mistake. She felt how important it was not only to apologize, but also to rebuild the trust that she had broken. She consulted a psychologist, attended support groups, read books on relationships and self-knowledge. She worked on her emotions and tried to understand why she had taken this step. Sarah came to the conclusion that her act was not so much the result of shortcomings in her relationship with Daniel, but rather her own insecurity and desire to feel wanted and valued. She realized that she had never discussed her needs with Daniel and, perhaps, that was why she could not remain faithful. Daniel was in a different situation. After learning about the betrayal, he felt a deep disappointment. His world had turned upside down, and he couldn't understand why. His thoughts constantly revolved around the question of whether he had done something wrong. Maybe he hadn't paid enough attention to Sarah, or had been too focused on work, and because of that, their relationship was not what it used to be. His anger was mixed with pain and disappointment. But over time, he realized that blaming himself wasn't right. Sarah had made her own choice, and while it was hard to accept, he couldn't turn back time. Now he had to decide if he was ready to forgive her and give their relationship a chance to mend. The first few weeks after Sarah confessed her betrayal were difficult for both of them. They lived under the same roof, but a wall of silence had grown between them. Daniel tried to stay calm, and Sarah felt guilty every day. It was hard for her to look at him, knowing that she had betrayed him. But she couldn't let this opportunity pass her by, and she began to do everything in her power to rebuild trust. Over time, Daniel noticed changes in her behavior. He saw how she was working hard on herself, how she was trying to be open and honest. She no longer avoided difficult topics, as she had before. She tried to talk about her feelings, her fears, and even how hard it was for her to accept her mistake. These changes were small but significant. Daniel began to understand that Sarah really wanted to repair their relationship and was willing to work on herself. But his heart was torn. He still couldn't forgive her completely and didn't know if he could. He was afraid that even if he tried to give her another chance, it might end up happening again. But his children, Jacob and Lina, were watching everything that was happening. They knew that their parents were going through a difficult time, and although they couldn't understand all the nuances, they could see how their mother was trying to change the situation. Lina often spoke to her mother, asking why it had happened and what she was going to do to fix it. Jacob was more reserved, but he could see that his parents were changing. Meanwhile, Sarah increasingly realized that the most important thing for her future relationship with Daniel was to be honest and open, even if it hurt. She began to write a diary, where she expressed all her emotions and experiences. She wrote about her doubts, her fears, her desire to regain Daniel's trust. With each passing month, they gradually began to establish communication. Daniel was still cautious, but Sarah was determined to show that she deserved a second chance. Every day became a test for Sarah. She couldn't just ask for forgiveness, she had to demonstrate changes so that Daniel could see that she really wanted to make things right. She began to spend more time with her children, because this was another important step in restoring their family. Lina and Jacob sensed her efforts and began to open up more to their mother. Lina even took a few steps towards improving her relationship with her parents, understanding that they were going through a difficult time, but that this did not mean that they had lost everything. At the same time, Daniel was trying to understand in his own way whether it was possible to forgive the betrayal. His feelings were mixed. Part of his heart yearned to regain what had been lost, but another part feared the same pain again. He realized that he couldn't just forget, but could he still make a new beginning? This question haunted him. A few months after Sarah began to show signs of change, she invited Daniel to talk. She realized that this time she was not only lacking in her desire, but also in Daniel's willingness to open his heart again. She thanked him for his patience and said that she was ready to do everything possible to make their relationship even stronger. Daniel, trying to stay calm, expressed his thoughts about everything that had happened. He said that it was difficult for him to forgive her betrayal, but he also understood that this was their shared experience. He thanked her for changing, for trying to be better, but he said that he still needed time to fully forgive her. He needed to understand whether he could trust her again, whether he could accept her back, even if she deserved it. Sarah was prepared for the fact that it might take even longer. She did not hear instant forgiveness, but she was willing to wait. She understood that only patience and constant work on herself could bring Daniel back to her. She also understood that even if she got another chance, it did not mean that everything would be the same as before. She was ready to build their relationship from scratch if necessary. After a few months, as the tension between them gradually subsided, Daniel began to open up more. He tried to communicate more with her, to talk about his feelings, his experiences, even the fears that remained. They were small steps, but they bore fruit. Sarah began to feel that he really wanted to try. Their relationship was not perfect, and sometimes there were moments when they experienced difficulties, but they were willing to work through them together. They began to see a therapist to improve their communication and understand each other better. They understood that this path would be long, but it was the only way to restore what had been broken. Over time, Daniel began to notice that the changes in Sarah were real. She was honest and open, she did not hide anything, and when difficult situations arose, she sought to resolve them constructively. Her apologies were no longer just words, they became actions that helped to strengthen their trust again. Their relationship continued to improve, and although they could not return to what it was before the betrayal, they were building something new and stronger. Sarah was still working on herself, trying to understand the deeper reasons for her mistake, and Daniel began to believe that he had a chance to get what he was looking for: real and unconditional trust. Each day was a small step towards restoring their relationship. They were no longer the same people they had been before, but this did not necessarily mean the end of their journey together. They learned to go through difficulties together and rejoice in even small victories, because they knew that the most important thing was to be willing to work for each other. Months passed, and although Sarah and Daniel did everything they could, their path was not cloudless. They both understood that even after all their efforts, everything could go back if they were not vigilant in their relationship. Sarah began to find small joys in ordinary moments again, in the way Daniel made breakfast for the children, or how they looked at old photos together in the evenings. They had more moments to themselves, more conscious and carefree moments, which was lacking before. But at the same time, Daniel could not completely let go of what had happened. His fears still burned in his heart, and he was afraid that one day he would find himself in the same situation again. Sometimes he would notice some small thing, for example, if Sarah was a little late for work, or if her phone was suddenly on silent mode. This caused him a feeling of anxiety, and he often had to remind himself that these were just his experiences, not reality. For Sarah, these were difficult moments. She saw how difficult it was for Daniel to let go of his fears, and it made her feel responsible for every doubt he had. She knew he needed more time to get over the pain, and she understood that it wasn't just getting over it, it had to be done over and over again, step by step. She was willing to work to earn his trust back, even if it took even more patience. One night, as they sat at dinner talking about the day, Daniel suddenly admitted that he was still afraid that their relationship might fall apart again. He said that even though he could see the changes in her, he still didn't know how to fully accept her back. Sarah couldn't answer right away because it was painful to hear, but she knew it was part of the process. Then she did something she had never done before: she asked for help. She suggested that they both go through couples therapy, to get help not only from psychologists but also from each other. She said she wanted to do everything she could to not only rebuild trust but also to build a relationship that would be even stronger than the one they had before her betrayal. She promised Daniel that she would not look for easy ways, but would only work on herself and them as a couple. It was a difficult decision. They were both tired of the emotional strain that accompanied each day, but they also understood that they could not continue without help. And so they signed up for their first session. The therapist they went to helped them understand that their relationship was not just black and white. There were many shades of gray, many nuances that determined their actions and reactions. It turned out that Daniel needed not only to forgive, but also to find a way to rebuild his faith that love could be stable and safe. And for Sarah, it was important not only to work on herself, but also to learn to regain the ability to accept herself without guilt. After a few therapy sessions, they began to understand each other better. They no longer criticized each other for every little thing and began to listen to what the other had to say. They felt that even through all the pain and disappointment, they still had the opportunity to build a new phase in their relationship. From time to time, their experiences returned, but now they were able to cope with them together. They learned to find compromises and work on making their communication open and honest. Sarah understood that Daniel might never be able to forget her betrayal, but he was starting to believe again in the possibility of a future together. They were no longer naive, but they were ready to accept whatever life brought them, if it meant they would walk this path together. A year after it all began, Sarah and Daniel celebrated their anniversary. They didn't celebrate like they used to, but it was a special day. They had become different people, and although there were still moments when they felt pain, they understood that this was part of the process. They no longer ran from their emotions, but embraced them. They had found their harmony again, not perfect, but real. Over time, they no longer wondered if it was possible to get back what had been lost. They knew that they were creating something new, and that was more important than anything that had come before. After Sarah and Daniel began working on their relationship in therapy, they gradually began to feel that their lives were changing. It was not an instant transformation, but a slow and ongoing process, in which each day brought new challenges. They were no longer the same people they had been before. This period had forced them to look at each other again, not from the perspective of the past, but from the perspective of what they could create together. Over time, Daniel began to open up more. He realized that his feelings of hurt would not simply disappear with time, and that he needed to not only forgive, but also learn to trust again. He began to realize that his relationship with Sarah was not just about betrayal. There were also a huge number of moments of joy and support that they had experienced together. The betrayal could not simply be forgotten, but a way could be found to move forward. Daniel began to pay more attention to how Sarah was changing. He noticed that she began to spend more time with the children, take more interest in their lives, actively help them at school, and even involve them in household chores. She began to support him at work, help him solve everyday problems, and showed him that she not only wanted to, but could, be a true partner in their relationship. She became more attentive to him, realizing that even the smallest acts of support and understanding can make a big difference in a relationship. But their journey was not painless. Sometimes Daniel felt that Sarah's changes were too new and unnatural, and then he again became anxious about whether she had really changed or whether she still had problems that remained hidden. Sometimes he tried to isolate himself from her emotions, believing that this would help him protect himself from possible disappointments. Sarah noticed these moments. She understood that even though she was doing her best to show Daniel her commitment and desire to change, he still couldn't completely let go of his fear. She couldn't make him forget, but she could only continue to act in ways that confirmed her intentions in practice. With each passing month, their communication became more open, and they both began to understand that their love could not be restored based on simple forgiveness. It could only be restored through daily work, honesty, and a willingness to sacrifice. They worked to be more sensitive to each other's feelings in order to create a new level of trust. The process was difficult, but over time they began to understand that even if they could not return everything to the way it was before, they could create a new future. They both decided that despite the difficulties they had experienced, their family was worth fighting for. One day, after months of therapy, they decided to take a symbolic step forward. They went on a short vacation together, to a place they had enjoyed visiting together when their relationship was on the rise. It was their chance not only to reconnect, but also to rediscover the connection that had once united them. It was their new beginning. During this trip, as they sat by the lake, Sarah looked at Daniel and said that she was grateful for every moment they had shared together, even the painful ones. She said that the betrayal had been her biggest misstep, but that it had made her realize how important a true relationship and trust were. Daniel, although still feeling some pain, replied that he was ready to continue on this journey with her, and although he still had his doubts, he was ready to try again. He didn't promise that everything would be perfect, but he promised that he would try to work on himself so that they could create a future together. This was a turning point. They knew this journey wouldn't be easy, but they were willing to walk it together. They were both changing and growing, and while their love was never the same, they began to realize that this new love was deeper, more conscious, and more real. With each passing year, their family grew stronger. Daniel and Sarah were no longer afraid to talk openly about their feelings and experiences. They learned to rebuild trust, even when times were tough, and this allowed them to grow stronger. And while their journey wasn't without pain, they were able to find new beauty in it, in the ability to change, forgive, and not give up. Over the years, their lives stabilized, but at the same time, there was constant improvement. Sarah and Daniel eventually began to accept each other with all their flaws and mistakes. This didn't mean that their story was without obstacles, but they became able to overcome any difficulties together. They no longer left conflicts unresolved and were not afraid to openly discuss their problems. They knew that it was through working on their relationship together that they would be able to make it stronger. Sarah continued to work on herself. She became more aware of her own actions and feelings. She had to learn to be patient not only with Daniel, but also with herself. She realized that the betrayal was the result of her own internal problems and dissatisfaction with her life, but now she was ready to actively change. She began to attend personal growth trainings, meditate, and learn to be a better version of herself. Daniel, in turn, became more and more free from his fears and doubts. He realized that forgiveness is not just words, it is an internal process that takes time. Sometimes it was difficult for him, and he still felt a flash of jealousy or pain at moments when his mind returned to the past. But over time, he learned to recognize these emotions and not let them control his actions. He also became more supportive of Sarah in her quest to change. It was a mutual process. Sarah needed to see that Daniel supported her, and Daniel needed to see that Sarah was willing to continue working on herself. And while they were both changing, they still didn't have all the answers. Like any couple, they had moments of disappointment and doubt. Sometimes life brought new challenges, and even old problems would resurface. But now they had not only love, but also an understanding that real relationships take work. And they weren't afraid to work on them. One day, they set off on another journey, this time to a new place. They realized they needed some time alone, free from the distractions and stresses of everyday life. It was their chance not just to relax, but to reconnect with each other in peace and quiet. They spent several days on this journey, hiking in the mountains, talking about everything in the world, what had happened in the past and what they wanted to build in the future. They began to see more possibilities for themselves as a couple, and they felt again that bond that, although broken, had not been destroyed. That evening, after a long walk at sunset, Daniel unexpectedly turned to Sarah. He said that he finally understood why it was important to go through all the hardships, because only through trials can people find out how ready they are for each other. He said that he was no longer afraid of their past and was ready to look to the future with her, even if it took even more time and effort. Sarah, hearing this, felt her heart filled with gratitude and love again. She understood that her relationship with Daniel had been her greatest life challenge, but also her greatest achievement. They had been through so much, and now this was a new chapter in their lives. They could not change the past, but now they knew that together they could overcome whatever lay ahead. And although their path had been full of struggles, they were able to build a new relationship, based not only on love, but also on trust, compassion, and mutual understanding. They had become true partners, not perfect, but real. And that was their strength. This journey was just the beginning of a new phase in their life together. They knew that life would bring new challenges, but now they were ready for them together. After returning from their trip, Daniel and Sarah began a new phase in their relationship. They felt that, despite all the difficulties, their lives were gradually returning to a normal rhythm. But their experiences did not disappear without a trace. They continued to work on themselves and their relationship, but this time they were sure that they were not just restoring, but creating something new, healthier, and stronger. A year after their critical moment, when Sarah betrayed Daniel, both realized that this betrayal had changed them not only in a negative way, but also provided an opportunity for personal growth. They were no longer the same people they had been before. They had become more mature, attentive, and, most importantly, open to new opportunities. They understood that only through self-knowledge and honesty with each other could they move forward. Sarah felt that she was beginning to restore her inner harmony, although she understood that she still had much to strive for. Her relationship with Daniel became deeper. And although he could not forget the past, he began to accept her as she was now. He no longer took her every gesture or word as a hint that she might betray him again. They both understood that now they were not just living together, but that their future would be built on new values. But one day, when everything seemed stable, fate made new changes. Sarah found out that she was expecting a child. It was shocking for both of them. At first, it brought immense joy, but at the same time fear. Were they really ready for a new stage in their relationship, given what had happened? Sarah began to worry that it would again be difficult for her to find a balance between new responsibilities and old experiences, and Daniel felt uneasy. His thoughts returned to the past, to what had happened after her betrayal. He could not help but ask himself if he was ready for this again. This new development forced them to go through a time of uncertainty again, even if this period presented them with new challenges. They knew that now they had more than just problems between the two of them, but also a new responsibility, a child who would change everything. They went to a therapist again to help them deal with the emotions that had arisen from their past. They didn't want this fear of recurrence to cause their relationship to fall apart. During therapy, they realized that their ability to be parents and build a relationship with their child did not depend on what had happened in the past. They realized that the best thing they could do for their future and their child's future was to rebuild trust and work on being better people and partners. They didn't intend to idealize their future, but they knew that this time they would be ready for all the challenges. Sarah increasingly began to notice how her priorities had changed. Now her main goal was to create a safe and loving environment for her child. She wanted to be a better mother and wife, to support Daniel, and to always take care of his emotional well-being. She no longer put her guilt first. She knew that the past could not be changed, but the future could be worked on. Daniel, for his part, began to trust her more. Although he still felt anxious in his heart, he understood that for him this was a chance to start over. He also realized that even in the most difficult times they could support each other, and that was important. Each new step, each day that they supported each other, helped him to restore faith in their relationship. When Sarah gave birth to a child, a little boy, it was a great celebration for them. It was a moment when they felt that they had gone through all the difficulties together and were now able to start a new phase of their lives. They finally truly felt that they could create a family in which there was room for love, support, and growth. They became more united as a couple. They were able to leave behind old fears and focus on what was important now, on their baby, on their relationship, on the new life they were creating together. Sarah and Daniel realized that their happiness did not depend on whether their relationship was perfect, but on whether they were willing to work on it and be together. Despite everything that had happened, they no longer idealized their future, but this was their real future, a future that they created together, without fear and with hope. Sarah returned home after meeting James. She could not shake the feeling that everything she had strived for had suddenly become a blur. She felt her inner world change, and the news she learned struck her like lightning straight to her heart. It seemed that all this time, she had been living a lie, seeking forgiveness and restoration, while at the same time not knowing the truth about what was happening around her. After she returned home, her thoughts were full of intertwined emotions. She sat in the kitchen, her eyes empty, her mind refusing to believe what had happened. Sarah looked at her family, her son, sleeping peacefully in his crib, her husband, who had been her support even when she couldn't find herself. But now it all seemed different. The question haunted her: how long could she be blind? How long was she willing to forgive and live in ignorance, even if it was only a temporary illusion? That evening, she felt a heavy burden fall on her shoulders. Everything she had achieved now seemed in question. She had already experienced betrayal, felt her own heart irreparably damaged, and found herself once again in a situation where trust seemed to have been completely shattered. Sarah was in no hurry to tell Daniel everything. She needed her alone time to think about what to do next. Over the next few days, her soul was filled with doubts, but she knew she would have to make a choice. During this time, she had a chance to not only understand whether she was ready to trust her husband again, but also to understand who she really was. In the end, Sarah decided to leave it all in the past and move on. She knew that she could not return to her old relationship with Daniel, despite the fact that he had also experienced his own pain associated with her betrayal. A lot of time passed, and they came to the understanding that their relationship could no longer be restored. It was too painful for both of them, and although they were able to create a new dynamic, they were no longer the same people they had been in the beginning. Sarah made a difficult decision: she left Daniel. She knew that this was an important part of her journey to self-discovery and self-preservation. She needed to get out of this cycle of pain and start a new life, to rebuild herself and, perhaps, find true happiness, regardless of whether it would be with Daniel or without him. Time passed, and every day Sarah began to feel more and more calm. She did not look for answers to all the questions that arose in her head after she found out about her husband's betrayal. She let go of the pain and realized that her true strength is her ability to live for herself, without looking back. Daniel had changed too. Although it was difficult for him to accept her decision, he realized that sometimes love and sacrifice are not always enough to keep a person together. He began to work on himself, becoming more independent and mature. He let go of the past, although not without pain. And then one day, a few years later, Sarah found out that Daniel had married another woman. It was unexpected, but looking at it from a present perspective, she realized that it was a necessary step for both of them. She, like him, had gone through her own transformation, and although their paths no longer crossed, they were no longer a pain for each other. She went to her son, looked at him with love, and calmly realized that the best thing they could do was give themselves a chance at a new life. They were both ready to move forward. And even when life presented her with even more challenges, she was ready to accept them. She no longer feared the future, because she had found her place in it again. The sense of completion she had was the opposite of the pain she had felt coming to this point. She understood that every moment was a chance to change herself and her life, even when it seemed like everything was already lost.